with whether it falls into a key therapeutic area and whether it is one of the selected molecular approaches that are considered by Merck senior scientists to be high probability of success targets.
And just to follow up, how important is it to have consensus across those various different decision makers, and how important is it to be championed by one or two people inside your organization?
Yeah, absolutely have to have a champion. In fact, one of the things that I've learned in my years of doing this particular job is that if I see a technology that I think is promising, I try very quickly to identify the person within the Merck Research Labs who's willing to stand up as the advocate for the project, because I can't do that. That's not, that's not within, that would be inappropriate for me to be the internal advocate for a program. I need a subject matter expert to advocate for the program and show why it's a good fit for the portfolio. So identifying a project champion quickly is key. Consensus is also very important. So this committee, which is populated by the senior neuroscience leaders at Merck, those people are Daryl Shep, David Michelson, Richard Hargreaves, Johan Lutman. We move forward quickly on programs where there's general consensus about the value to the Merck portfolio.
Really great panel. Thanks for organizing, and thanks to the panelists. I actually had a couple questions, if there's no one behind me. First one was for Jeff and Susan. Wanted to ask you about platform technologies versus technologies or companies that are focused on one particular target or a scaffold of molecules. And Jeff, you mentioned the paucity of CNS companies that were invested in the last several years. And I wonder whether that may be obscured a little bit by platform technology companies that could be applied to CNS as well as under other indications. And I guess another question related to that is, are you both looking for, is there a preference for sort of companies that have these broad platforms versus target or scaffold-specific companies?
Yeah, so with respect to those CNS company numbers, sure, it's possible, but double, triple, put any multiple on, it's still going to be a pretty small number. Different VCs have different opinions. Some VCs run their fund as a pipeline of projects, and in essence, they're looking at, single molecules. They may have single molecules in 10 different companies, and that's their portfolio, and they manage it almost like a little pharma company. Other VCs like platform. My firm, I think every biotech investment we've made has been a platform-oriented investment, at least at the outset. The challenge is, as we've had to carry the companies further in order to get to an exit, rapidly the platform diminishes in value, and whatever your lead clinical candidates are become really the value driver for the company. And so even though we've stuck to our guns and say that we continue to like platform, because increasingly we're being required to fund companies into phase 2, that's really where the value drivers end up. So I wouldn't give up on the platform orientation, but I do think you have to be clear in terms of your due diligence on VCs, what point of view the firm you're going in to talk to has. And then you still have to think about, well, I may love the platform, but if it's going to be the first couple things that get out of that platform, they're going to drive value. How does that factor into my thinking about this as a project that you're going to commit for a long time?
Before you go, a little bit, I don't know if everyone, including myself, really understands what a platform is.
Yeah, either do we. So platform is one of those great terms that is kind of over-defined. It means different things to different people. I guess one simple way of thinking about it is if you come in and say, we've got this chemistry, we've got a couple molecules that we progress further, and maybe we've got some other things in the background, but it's really these couple molecules that we think are drugs. Please fund the development of those. That's not platform. Everything else can be wedged into platform one way or another. Technologies that can lead to multiple potential chemistries. Could be some biologic system that you've worked out that gives you a good idea. Maybe you have no chemistry, and then you've got to bring chemistry to it. So it's kind of, I would say from the VC perspective, it's kind of a split. You either have got a drug or something you think is a drug, and we're going to invest in that little thing, or you've got something else, a technology. And then it's going to fall into this amorphous platform bucket. That's about the best I can do.
Yeah, on the question of platform technologies, we love them. In fact, I think Merck is one of those large pharmaceutical companies that has consistently invested in platform technology companies over the years and done a considerable number of deals with companies like that. I mean, we're looking at platform technologies that enable drug discovery and drug development. Of the 3 deals that I was involved in directly last year, 2 were platforms and 1 was a compound deal. So I would say, yes, we're all in. It has to be something that really helps us to do drug discovery, drug development cheaper, better, faster. One that I'm thinking of, which we did recently, is all about biomarkers. It's about getting a quicker jump on key biomarkers that are going to give us clinical readouts more quickly than anything we can do today. So, I mean, if that pays off, it's going to enable many of our clinical programs and make it much more economical for us to run more clinical trials with those kinds of markers in hand.
Hopefully a quick question, but I was wondering if Abram and maybe Jeff and Susan could comment on how you determine value in a technology, and just enlighten us on a little bit of the process when going into negotiations.
Right. So typically we don't establish an actual value. I mean, we could do a net present value calculation of saying in 15 years this is going to be $1 billion product and the chance of success is this much, and discounting back to try and put a value on it today. But since we're not selling it for a complete, for a one-time price, we don't really need to value it in that way. And so typically we generally go by rules of thumb and experience in terms of royalty rates and equity percentages based on the size of the market, the status of the development effort, and and try to balance the return that the investor or the company would be getting if it's a success, and and what we're getting. So we don't put an actual dollar value on it at any point, but it's more considering what should be our percentage of the ultimate success based on all the risks that our partner is taking versus the stage that we've got it at to start with.
Yeah, it's very formulaic. We have an internal financial group that runs the numbers on clinical stage opportunities. It's actually pretty straightforward for them to calculate an NPV. For preclinical stage deals, it's a little more back of the envelope guessing as to what the market will look like if we really could achieve something that would address the needs of Alzheimer's patients, for example.
And I would say from the VC perspective, particularly for these early deals, there is a market. So you do have a sense of what other funds are thinking that assets of a given stage are worth. But really it comes down to percentage ownership. So think about Frank's comments. I don't care what the valuation is. I just care how much of it I own, so how much I control. And so the earlier you are, the more concerned I probably am, and the more I want to control. So how much money you raise comes into it, because that's going to impact how much I get to buy in terms of a percentage number. But if you're ever talking to VCs and they get really stuck on a number, try to figure out what that means to them in percentage ownership, because that's really what they're thinking about.
Just one other thing, if you're coming at it from the university perspective with a VC, I would say that it's important from our history to keep some royalty percentage as well. So Jeff was just talking about the equity percentage, but as was mentioned earlier, there's things like common shares and preferred shares and substantial dilution. Even if the technology does well, you could hit a bad financial climate. So a royalty, even a small royalty, is a good thing to keep, that if it succeeds, you'll ultimately get a significant return from it, whereas the equity could disappear somewhere in the long development hurdles if the market goes south or you encounter difficulties.
I'd like to kind of continue this discussion. In the respect, as a small entity, when you approach a large entity, how do you protect the inventor? In other words, if I go to you with an idea, and basically I work in dogs, and the medicine in dogs is about 95% transferable to humans. So I have a reasonable expectation. Anything I see in dogs will probably apply to humans if I've characterized the disease well. So I go to Merck and I say, here's this works in dogs, it really works well. This dog has Alzheimer's disease. Actually, there's not real good models for dogs that I'm aware of. What's to prevent Merck from saying, gee, thank you, we've just spent $100 million on that and you've just solved our problem? I've had that happen in science with colleagues in colleagues in free exchange. What protections does a big corporation offer?
Yeah, so people like, I'm sort of the first filter of anything
Right.
that's coming into Merck, so I'm always very careful to make sure that, that anything that you want to share with me is appropriately covered by a confidentiality agreement if necessary. I'm also very careful when talking to outside parties not to accept invitations to share information if I think it's going to be somehow likely to contaminate an internal Merck program. I just don't want to hear about it is basically going to be the answer in some cases. Or it might be,
Well,
hey, listen, we have an internal program and we're willing to talk to you under a two-way confidential disclosure agreement with the understanding that that Merck already has a program that's running, and if you choose to share information with us, you've been fully informed that we have such a program, and there would be no future debates about, whether there were discoveries at Merck that had nothing to do with your invention that you could lay claim to.
Is it necessary to use an attorney at that stage because they really can't disclose because they don't know, or is that they don't have they have the executive summary?
Sometimes what we'll do, in a case where somebody on the outside is working on something that we're intensely interested in, but we don't want to risk any contamination of an internal Merck program, sometimes what we will do is bring in a third-party reviewer, somebody totally independent from Merck, who's agreed to by the outside party as being a reputable consultant or person, and the outside party will share information with that third party, and then that third party may, in formulating a report back to Merck, may share some of that information as long as it's all right with the outside party. Yeah.
Okay, it's very interesting. Very good panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to kind of put a perspective on it, from what Jeff said about VC investments, maybe 5 or 6 in CNS over each year for the last 3 years, probably a couple of pain programs, a couple of depression programs, maybe a schizophrenia program, and maybe a device program, and probably 0 in neurodegenerative disease. And then from Susan, from your perspective, I don't know how many relationships, contractually that you established. But I do remember a couple of years ago we had somebody from Wyeth speak and said that, as you just did, that maybe maybe they ended up doing 2 or 3 licenses or sponsored research agreements per year. And I asked them how many they saw, and the guy said he saw about 3,000. A huge number, because you, as you said, you go to a lot of places and see a lot of ideas in multiple therapeutic categories. So it seems like there's not, this is like making medicinal chemistry seem really easy, actually, I think, as far as, and so, there's government, there's philanthropy, and then I guess there's angels, and Frank, you sort of said that you don't like the angels either.
Well, I shouldn't generalize too much. There might be some really good, appropriate angels, but that's the risk inherent in that.
Yeah, but actually that was where I was going by illustrating that, the venture capital model for neurodegenerative diseases isn't really there, and it's really tough to get pharma on board, again, understandably because of risk and other reasons. It kind of just leaves either, SBIRs, which, get you a certain way, but they're hard to get also, or foundation money, or angels. So, in my experience, angels are becoming increasingly important, actually, as sources of funding for startup. And I wondered if you could comment a little further about that. Yeah, if you could comment, because you've had experience talking with them and so on.
Yeah. So the question of angels, I guess, what would be useful is to think about the criteria or the type of angel that you might be interested in speaking to. And since I live in an area where there are a lot of angels, and you get in these discussions all the time, you would just have your list. I mean, number one, that they have some understanding of the risks that are being undertaken here. Number two, they have some understanding that this is a multi-year process. We're not talking about weeks and months of good news and bad news. I think also angels that are in it for reasons in addition to financial return. They have a family member with a neurologic disease, et cetera. I think that's extremely important. So then it becomes a little bit of a hybrid model, angel philanthropy type thing. Number four, that they have some experience developing companies, and can they be helpful without getting in your way? And that's a very delicate double-edged sword. But I think given the landscape that you're laying out there, other than foundations, and you have this huge gap before you get to being a partner with Big Pharma, and 3 out of 3,000 per year, I think it probably is becoming more and more important. An interesting trend that I've seen in the Bay Area in non-biologics is angels putting in funding with taking no equity. And I guess that model is working out. They throw a lot of mud at the wall, don't take equity in any of them, and then see if a few hit. And that's, I guess, been a positive process. But again, comparing technology to what we do is always so treacherous because the time frames are so much different. So maybe the angel models will evolve and help fill this gap.
Yeah, we're seeing in many communities like Boston, New York, San Francisco, angel networks where angels band together. Maybe each family or whatever is putting 50,000 in or 200,000 in, but they're also banding together so that they can have meetings and get due diligence and then decide on investments as a group, so that mitigating risk among each individual. By investing in through the network, there's less risk to the founder that you're going to get calls every day, and that sort of thing. So we're seeing more and more angels affiliated with universities, for example, filling the gap. They want to help a university pull out a technology. So I think it's something to think about.
One thing that I would want to say in that context is, if you're going to take money from anybody, you have to think really, really hard about where you are at the end of that money. And where I've seen a lot of these angel processes break down is the angels put in money with an expectation of X, and the inventor or PI hasn't thought it out very well, and they can only get to half X with that money. And that's where things really can be a problem. And so it's really important to think about, with the amount of money I'm going to take, can I get to a milestone that matters to anybody? If you can't get a milestone that matters to anybody, don't take the money, because it's not going to be a pleasant experience for you or the person who put the money in. So you have to be very realistic about these milestones along the way. It's really to everybody's benefit if you peg the amount of money you have to what it is you need to get done.
That's a great point.
Yeah, kind of follow-up question with regard to Howard's ideas there, and more philosophical. Having worked in Big Pharma for many years before I actually joined a very small biotech company, I know that Big Pharma is becoming increasingly risk-aversive, especially in CNS. We have seen a lot of companies pulling out of CNS, psychiatry, Alzheimer's disease. And so there is a kind of disconnect between what you see at the early stage with the foundations, with the funding of very risky projects, of course, with the idea of many shots on goal, and maybe one shot actually will be successful. And then at the end of the work, you actually talk to big pharma companies, because they are the only ones who have the money to do the phase 3 trials, actually do the commercialization. And yet they're actually pulling out of those areas, and if they're staying in, many of them do the same thing. Everybody's working on a beta amyloid vaccination or something like that. So how do you see that kind of disconnect there between the, let's say, the inventor's urge to do very risky work, and then all the way down the road when you actually to sell that to a big pharma company who has a completely different view on risk aversiveness? Is there maybe a place for smaller biotechs, actually, like I think something like Vertex actually would develop this compound for cystic fibrosis, which is a small market, together with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation? Is there a kind of possibility of a collaboration between foundations and smaller biotech to bring such projects all the way down to commercialization? I would like to have your opinion on that.
I think you raise a really good point. There is a little bit of a disconnect, and I think what you're beginning to see is that foundations are not just investing in a project, in a series of experiments, and that's it. Many of the questions that we now ask the researchers that we fund are, what is your next step? What is your development path? What is the regulatory path? Who are you thinking about working with? At some point, it's going to move outside your lab or your resources or your company just by the nature of what's required now to be able to move things forward. I think the Vertex CFF example is really in a way where the field is heading. I think it'll be different for different diseases. I think for something like cystic fibrosis, probably it will be very much a joint venture because you will need to be able to have two groups come together. I think for others it may take a different form. I think what we've seen in Parkinson's is if we can get it up to a certain degree of proof of concept, and that will be different depending on the approach and also the actors who are evaluating it. People will step in. So we have seen that investments in preclinical have gotten a biotech a partnership with a large pharmaceutical company for $500 million, obviously milestoned out, etc. We have seen that our funding of a phase 1 trial has actually led a biotech company, to get $25 million in additional VC funds. I think it's now about foundations figuring out how they can leverage their funding so that it becomes a stamp of approval that groups like biotechs or academic labs can use to get some of that money, so that it's not always waiting till the phase 3, but there may be smaller amounts of money, but money that other actors are willing to put in. I also think foundations increasingly, as your pipeline matures and more things hopefully are hits and they are moving along, we will have to probably make larger and larger investments. And I think internally at MJFF, we have thought about the fact that we're likely in the next 2 or 3 years probably going to have to fund the beginning stages of a phase 3 trial because no one else will come to the table, or if it's a biotech, that biotech won't be able to get funding to immediately go into a phase 3. We won't be able to cover everything, but our hope is if we can start the trial and the process and the funding and people see that we're willing to put our money in, because of the reputation we have across the field, other actors will come in. We've seen it happen in smaller examples in the earlier stage, and our hope is that may hold true for later stage investments. So it's not a perfect science, we're moving there, but I think that groups are trying to figure out exactly the answer to what you're asking.
So this topic is on commercialization. And from a foundation perspective, even from a university perspective, I think Frank brought it up that sometimes priorities change. And so if a foundation or university is invested in a particular technology, I think Geron would be a classic example. If a company, a foundation interested in paralysis, invested heavily in them, now Geron's changed their tune and want to use their stem cell platform for another area of therapeutic area, I think that any organization which supported them would be very disappointed. Does ADDF or Michael J. Fox or even university have ways to kind of pull back the intellectual property so that they could, as you suggested, go on your own and try to start a phase 3 clinical trial or push the technology forward? Because it's your advisors and there's evidence that it's there. It's just that whom you've partnered with, their priorities have changed.
Yeah, I can answer, and then maybe Sohini, but we write contracts, and a large part of our contracts are advised by nonprofit law, so that when we have contractual relationships with for-profits, both sides actually remain within the confines of IRS regulations and this sort of thing. So when we fund a for-profit, like a company like Geron, publicly traded, or more often private, as Sohini said, the purpose of our funding is to advance the science. It's not to make a profit. If there is a profit, it's a secondary goal, and this is actually a regulatory statement. The primary goal of our investment is to advance the science, to advance our mission, and the secondary goal is that if there's a return, we believe that our capital is, our dollar is just as good as the next guy, and if there's a success, we should share the success, not for my pocket not for anybody else's pocket, for the purpose of having more money to invest in research. So part of our contracts do have sort of a reach, to say if the company decides, or even the university in most cases, decides not to pursue technology that we funded, that we feel deserves, for the benefit of the public good, which is the phrase that's really the key phrase, that we would have a right to reclaim that technology, to develop the IP. Not that we would likely do it, but some foundations would do it, and to reclaim the IP and to make sure that it moves forward. I think the better way to go about it, though, is when we try to get a stem cell company that's developing stem cells for Parkinson's disease, interested in Alzheimer's, we give them a grant to do Alzheimer's research. And I think that a better way would be that if we really felt strongly about a technology, at Geron, for example, that if Geron decided not to pursue it, it would be because of probably a limited financial budget, or management budget, that they just don't have the resources, time, or money to keep doing it. And I think if we were really excited about it and we had the resources to keep it going, that we would want to continue to fund the program in Geron to make sure that it does keep going. But you're right, a lot of times companies change and they decide to go from neuroscience to dermatology, and sometimes that's just, it happens. I don't know, Sandy, if you have any.
I would agree with everything you said. I actually think it's also being flipped a little bit, where companies that we may not have funded their programs are, for business reasons, shelving it, and they have now started to approach us and say, we believe in the scientific merit. We ourselves are not going to develop it further. Are you interested in perhaps taking that on? Last year alone, we were approached by 3 different large pharma asking us in very broad, nebulous terms about our interest. And we've engaged in further discussion for some, not all, but I think that as foundations are assuming a greater and greater role in drug development because of the way risk is being perceived and where funds are coming from, it is not inconceivable that soon we will be, just like we are trying to pitch things to pharma or VCs, they may very well be beginning to start to pitch it to foundations if they believe the scientific rationale of something but cannot make the business case internally.
And I think that's a great point. Actually, we're also interested in the shelving issue, that there are thousands of really good compounds that, sitting on the shelf in industry that just weren't pursued for various reasons, and philanthropies, can pull it out. I think, the theme here being philanthropy saves everybody, and actually we can't. There's just no way. So I don't want to oversell what philanthropy can do. I mean, but it is. I think shelving is another opportunity for philanthropy to accelerate drug discovery.
I'm curious, given the lifespan of patents and the long time that it can take, say, for an academic investigator to first identify a target for something, and maybe approach somebody in the tech transfer office and do that early patent you talked about, versus the time point at which pharma might be interested in investing. How much does that patent lifespan have a role in pharma choice to actually invest if it took 20 years to get it, to the point that pharma might actually be interested, and then they're thinking maybe they'll only have 2 years of a patentable product?
In the case of licensing deals that are for compound therapeutics, the patent coverage is extremely important. It's one of the first bits of due diligence that we conduct on an opportunity. That said, I mean, there are plenty of cases where, and Merck is involved in some, where there was no composition of matter coverage on a compound, yet there was a business case for developing the compound and at least getting some market exclusivity associated with the launch of that new product. So it all depends. It will all depend on unmet medical needs, market opportunities, and whether there is, in the absence of composition of matter, a strong case for obtaining some market exclusivity on the product once developed.
Yeah. And Marty Watterson just pointed out, with the patent law changes, that going to first to file it's going to become more of a problem with the clock ticking as soon as the patent is filed, so not until the patent's granted. So it's going to be more difficult. Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
Just a quick question directed to Frank, and I really enjoyed his presentation. I was wondering if you, in the light of all the obstacles as you were trying to bring VC and approach, launching your own company, did you happen to, I mean, you didn't go through the science, but I'm just wondering if you had second thoughts as you were going through this process where you thought potentially you had enough compelling of a data package to go directly to pharma and essentially try to collaborate within an academic setting as another model towards commercialization.
Yeah, the question is, should you go to, big pharma earlier and collaborate academically? I think, I did spend some time. Again, you end up knowing people that work at big pharma and having some interactions. I think the technology really has to be matured a lot before that collaboration is really an enjoyable or productive thing. I mean, that's just my sense, my bias, is that you have to get to the appropriate point of maturation. I think if it's too early, it's just less likely it's going to go anywhere or be prioritized, or just too many questions. So I've actually enjoyed the process of maturing the technology and at least trying to be smart about it, getting a lot of outside and critical input, but in the end staying focused. I found that some of the models, again, I'm not in big pharma, there are a lot of people here that have more expertise than I do. Once you get into a kind of a committee environment, boy, you're going to have one question with 20 answers, and it just gets really confusing, and the technology can easily get thrown off track. Presumably, you're the expert in your technology. You have people all over the country who are your peers you can get input from at no cost, and you can mature it, I think. And I think that's better in the long run for your eventual partner to mature it. So I've enjoyed maturing it, and if I had to do it all over again, I would do the same thing.
Our last question.
So my point was about what you said, Howard, about shelving the thousands of compounds in pharma shelves that might potentially have uses. Maybe a word of caution there. I'm having been in the pharma side, I don't know that there are that many pharmas that would have a wonderful compound that they just leave on the shelf. I think have to be careful about when we are setting up any of those explorations that we're not in a situation of essentially looking at the bottom of the barrel and the dregs. I think the positive side of it is essentially when you think about it in the context of across therapeutic areas, it may well be that there are compounds sitting on the shelf that have been explored for indication X, but really haven't been taken through the paces for indication Y. But not necessarily that they're such a great compound that they just for pure business reasons put it away, because usually companies will actively, if it's an asset that they feel has some value, they will try to get some return on it by out-licensing it or doing something else with it. And I don't know if Susan or others wanted to comment on that aspect to sort of think about.
Yeah, I think your point is well taken, and so I too would have pushed back on the comment about thousands of compounds being shelved, which could be repurposed. I don't think there are thousands. I think in big pharma, when programs are deprioritized, it may be because of portfolio decisions. That is, we're not going to work in neuroscience any longer, or we're not going to work in cardiovascular disease any longer. And in those cases, it makes probably good sense to go to those companies and look at those assets that were deprioritized due to portfolio decisions. But in other cases where compounds were shelved because they didn't demonstrate efficacy in a phase 2 trial, you really need to ask questions about all other aspects of the profile of those compounds before you decide to invest your big bucks in developing them, because as the questioner just pointed out, there are probably other reasons why compounds were shelved, and if there was real unmet medical need and market opportunity there, chances are it would be an ideal asset for out-licensing to somebody else who would be willing to enter into a partnership that would be revenue generating for the big pharma company. So just be careful as you set out on that course.
And just one other point to make in that is that even if an asset has been in the shelf, sometimes it's actually quite hard to find out why it was put on the shelf in the first place. And getting that information out is not straightforward, not because the company doesn't want to divulge it. Sometimes the project team has been disbanded, people have left the company. It's not, these days it's getting better, but there are records that haven't been digitized. It's not easy to go back and actually figure out why a particular decision was arrived at a certain meeting at a certain point in the project's life cycle.
Great. All right. Well, again, thanks for a great panel and everybody attention.